Oh. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining today. Just before we get started, can everybody hear me? If you can, just pop a message in the chat, please. Okay, perfect. Well, welcome into the webinar today. Today, we're going to be talking about the discussion chapter of the dissertation. I see we have a question in the chat, so let me just take a look at that really quickly. So yes, participants should be muted, and we are going to get started right now. Lee, I'm sorry that you have to step out. You will all receive a copy of the slides and the recording today, so you won't miss anything. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, but we'll go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to be talking about the discussion chapter and just a little bit of background on statistics solutions. We are a dissertation editing and consulting company. So we help students with the dissertation from the very early stages of topic development, developing research questions, all the way through each of the chapters, so chapters 1 through 5. And we also assist students with developing their materials for their defense. So your PowerPoint slides for the defense or your PowerPoint slides for the proposal. I'll share a little bit more about our services towards the end here, but you will see in the chat there are a few links to our website. We do offer free resources online, mostly blog posts about different dissertation-related topics and also webinars for each of the chapters. And then we also provide a free 30-minute consultation. So if you're someone who thinks you could use some assistance, but you aren't really sure where to get started, go ahead and reach out to us for that consultation and we'll help out. But again, today we're going to talk about the discussion chapter. So that's typically chapter 5. Every school is a little bit different. So your school may, have it numbered differently, but we're going to be talking about the discussion. Generally, the contents that go into the discussion chapter are the introduction, the interpretation of the findings, the limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for future research, and then a summary. One thing that we always tell students is before you start writing, make sure you have access to a template or a dissertation checklist to ensure that you are including the correct sections for your school. Some schools differ, so they may want you to include something extra, or they may, maybe something from this list that I have here belongs in a different chapter at your school. So I just recommend checking in with your reviewers or your chair committee, your chair or your committee to make sure you know exactly what goes into this particular section. If you don't have a resource like that available to you, this list is pretty comprehensive, so this is a good starting place. So when you start off writing your discussion, remember that by this point, you would have already conducted all of your data collection procedures and you will have already analyzed all of your data. So this is not where we're going to be presenting the results, but instead we're going to be contextualizing the results of your study in the greater field of literature. So where do you fall within the literature? And then speaking to some of the specific pieces of your study that can be used for future research or for the particular topic or profession or population that you're studying. So how do I fit? And then how can this information be used in the future? So to begin this chapter, you'll start with a brief introduction, very similar to the other chapters. In this introduction, you are going to want to reorient the reader to your study. So you want to restate the purpose and really remind the reader of why your study is needed. Now, when you are restating the purpose, it's important to remember that that should be restated verbatim. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining consistency from chapter to chapter. So each time you restate the purpose or you restate the research questions for your study, you can go ahead and just copy and paste those over. It may feel redundant as you're reading it through, but this is just going to be helpful for your reader so that when they're beginning each time, they're just getting reoriented and they have a very clear understanding of what this study is about and what the purpose of this study is. Once you do that, then you will preview the contents of the chapter for your reader. So that can be as simple as, listing out these section headers that I had on the previous slide. So interpretation of the findings, limitations, implications for practice, recommendations for future research, and summary. You might say something like, in this chapter, the researcher will present, each of those things and list out those section headings. So now the reader knows what the study is about and what they should expect in this coming chapter. So then you're going to get into the meat of the section here. So in the interpretation of the findings, the way that you structure this section will differ based on the type of study that you are doing. If your study is a quantitative study, it may make sense for you to section your interpretation out based on the research question that you are talking about. Whereas if your study is qualitative in nature, then it may make sense to go through the discussion by themes as opposed to research question. So those would be your subheadings for this section, either the research question you're answering or the theme. Now, when you're doing this, you're going to want to make sure that you are restating or summarizing the finding or the theme. In that summary of the theme, remember that you've already or the research question, not just the theme, depending on what you're studying. Remember that in the results chapter, you've already given a very in-depth look at this particular response to the research question or theme. So here, rather than kind of going back and pulling participant quotes, if it's qualitative, or really reporting the statistics again, if it's quantitative in nature, you're just going to be summarizing what those themes mean. And then you will talk about your findings within the greater kind of pool of literature. I see a comment about no sound. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, great. And I think maybe check your machine there, but let us know if there's anything we can do to help. Okay, so you're going to want to talk about these results within the field of greater literature. So that means that you want to talk about where your findings agreed with previous literature and also where they maybe didn't agree. So did you find anything novel through your study? Did you find anything that leads you to believe the findings are inconclusive? So maybe you found something completely different in your study. Whatever that looks like for you, you just want to discuss, really just contextualize where you land within the articles that you've discussed in your literature search, where you're the same and where you're different. In that, of course, you'll be highlighting any novel findings. So if you found maybe a qualitative theme that has not been previously reported on for a specific population or for a specific sample or for a specific topic, then you'll want to talk about those novel findings and really explain what exactly was new about it, how do you know that it hasn't been seen before, and you'll want to provide some citations to really expand on that further. You'll do the same for any findings that you have that are not supported by previous research. So if, for example, you are doing a quantitative study and in previous literature, the researchers are finding an association between two variables. But then when you look at your particular sample, you're not finding that same association, that's okay. Sometimes when we get into these studies, we think that we have to have a certain outcome. But if you find something that you don't expect, that's okay. This is just the space where you're going to talk about that. And potentially think about why that association is not existing. So maybe was there a confounding variable, maybe like socioeconomic status, or did it have something to do with your sampling? So really just kind of thinking through like what are the pieces of your study that may have altered the results in a way that made those findings different from previous literature. And then through that, you will draw some conclusions of your findings. So kind of those final statements about what these findings really mean. And to do that, you can pull from your knowledge from your program, from your knowledge about that particular field. This is where you can kind of get creative and really be thinking about, why does this matter? And kind of start that bridge of how can this research be used to inform future populations or practice. So once you've gone through and provided your interpretation, you are going to go into the limitations of your study. So here you'll want to talk about any shortcomings or weaknesses that may have affected the results of your study. When you're thinking about limitations, it's important to note that these are not just things that are inconvenient, right? So we don't want to think about maybe, let's think of what's a good inconvenience to give as an example. Maybe something like you weren't able to recruit at a particular location. That might not necessarily rise to the level of a limitation. A limitation might be something like if you're in a quantitative study, you were not able to reach your intended sample size. That limitation has implications for the generalizability of your results. So that would really rise to the level of something that you would want to report in this limitation section. And that kind of goes with the second point here. So you'll also want to discuss the generalizability of your results to the larger population. So again, if your study is quantitative in nature, the intention for that type of research method is to generate results that are generalizable. So if you were not able to achieve a particular sample size, or if you had some struggles in that area and you're finding that these results are not really generalizable, this is a really good place to discuss that and possibly discuss why that is, what went on during data collection that led to that and what were some of the challenges. And then if your study is qualitative in nature, that is not intended to really be generalizable. So that's something that you might point out here. A limitation of a qualitative method is that the sample size is smaller because you are conducting like participant interviews or observations. So because that sample size is smaller, the results are not intended to be generalizable to the larger population. When you're thinking about limitations, by the time you get to the discussion, something else you can do to really kind of inspire some ideas is think back to your proposal. in the proposal, you most likely listed or explained some limitations that you anticipated. So if you get down to writing the limitations and you're kind of at a sticking point, I would recommend referring back to that, see what you said in that phase, and if anything, you know, held true and carried over to when you were carrying out your research, you can report back on those. And then the second resource I would recommend reviewing to really write this limitations section is going into the literature related to your specific research design or research method. So every design and method has its own limitations. For example, you know, if you are doing a correlational design, we know that correlation does not explain causation. So that is one potential limitation that you can discuss. And again, all of those kind of hallmark limitations for research design will be documented in the literature. So you may, as you're doing your initial literature search, just start to bullet out some of those hallmark limitations to have them in your back pocket for when you start writing this section. Next, he will talk about the implications for practice. So here, I want you to think about the particular population that your study is drawing inferences about. So are you doing a study about teachers? Are you doing a study about pregnant women or principals, whatever it may be? How does this particular study help and inform the work that those people do? So again, this is a really fun section, I think, because you can be very creative here. And this is kind of that like change the world, you know, feeling during the PhD where you're thinking about, okay, how does my research impact the people that I'm hoping to reach? So this is where you're going to be thinking about that. Depending on your research questions, this may look different. So if you're doing a study to maybe look at associations between two variables. So let's say you want to look at the relationship between cardiovascular disease and smoking status among adolescents, for example. This is where you might talk about, you know, most likely there is an association between cardiovascular disease and smoking status within this population. Here, the implications for practice might be, you know, we need to address this issue by using targeted strategies to decrease the rate of tobacco use among this population or among this sample. So here's where you're really thinking about the what now. You know, I have all this information. What can I do to make someone's life a little bit easier or better with this research? Another example could be if your study is qualitative, so maybe you're not looking at associations, but you want to understand the maybe the strategies that teachers use to mitigate conflict in the classroom. So maybe you collected qualitative data where you're interviewing teachers, you're asking them what they do, you know, they're telling you about their experiences. And then your implications for practice could be maybe a clear plan or, you know, conceptual framework to implementing some of the strategies that you learned about through the qualitative interviews in other populations, so in other schools or, you know, with other teachers, or having some sort of listening session where you are having teachers share these strategies. So again, here's where you can be creative, but you also want to be within the scope of your study, right? So if you're saying, if you're looking at a study, maybe with that first example with the cardiovascular disease and smoking status, it can be really easy to kind of go above and beyond with the implications for practice, but I would try to keep one that's close to home. So kind of like what's one step up of something that you can do or something that individuals who come in contact with the population can do to make a change. Try to think of one step up as opposed to like, with that particular example, this is kind of a dramatic example, but instead of saying like, oh, we will remove the sale of tobacco products, you know, in a town, try to just remain within that scope and not going too far away from kind of what's feasible. So think about that as well. And then once you've discussed those implications for future for practice, you will go into your recommendations for future research. So in this section, you really want to, again, look at the literature related to your variables or your topic under study or your particular population, and try to brainstorm here. If you could change your study, what would you do to change the study? What would you do to improve it? What would you change? What would you do more of? All of these things can be helpful to individuals who might be interested in conducting research on this topic in the future. So with this section here, just like most of the dissertations, someone should be able to really pick it up and kind of take on where you've left off. So your recommendations should be based on the findings. So one example I always like to give, if you conducted a quantitative study maybe, so again, we'll go with my example of tobacco use among adolescents and cardiovascular outcomes. So maybe that's your study, and you find that there is an association between the tobacco use and the negative cardiovascular outcomes or cardiovascular disease. What might be a good next step for individuals who want to study those two variables together in that population? You might propose that the next researcher approach the same topic with a qualitative lens. So it can be as simple as just changing the research method in future research. So maybe instead of just looking at the associations quantitatively, we look at, well, why are adolescents engaging in tobacco use? You know, why are they using it? Where are they accessing it? So to do that and to get down to that level, you might need to conduct a qualitative study. So that could be a potential recommendation for future researchers. These recommendations can also be rooted in the limitations of your study or your design. So again, thinking about the particular design or method that you use, you can build off the limitations and recommend changes in that design based on those limitations. So that kind of goes with that first example that I shared. You know, when we're looking at these variables quantitatively, we may not be understanding the why behind tobacco use, or we might not be understanding the access of that for that particular population. So for that reason, a qualitative study may be a good next step. Another thing to consider here regarding your limitations, if you had a sample size limitation, or if you had a sample that was not very heterogeneous, like maybe you just had individuals who are of one particular race or maybe of one particular socioeconomic status, and you weren't getting to really see kind of real life parameters because of the limit on your variability within that sample, that may be something else that individuals will need to increase the scope of their recruitment in order to recruit a diverse sample. So again, just kind of being creative here and thinking about, you know, what can be done better or what can be changed. Here, you may also want to highlight any areas where your findings were inconclusive. So if past literature found, you know, no, there is no association between these two variables, and then your study found, yes, there is, that's good grounds for somebody else to continue the research, maybe with a different, you know, sampling strategy, a different recruitment method, a different type of design, to further understand what is that association, because at this point it's inconclusive. So again, those inconclusive results can be an opportunity for future research as well. And the same goes with the novel findings. If you find something new, which can be very tricky, so if you don't find a novel finding, you know, don't feel bad. that is kind of difficult, considering how much research has already been done. But if you do find a novel finding, that is a great springboard for future research into that finding, because this paper that you write here will be the first where that's found. So, you know, that's a good place to go as well. And then again, as I said, you can recommend those different types of designs or methods to really keep this going as well. I also recommend when you're thinking about future research or when you're doing your initial literature search to just kind of document the different types of designs or methods that have been used to study the variables that you're interested in, because that will help kind of build some of the narrative for this section here. That way you're not having to go back and do a full literature search again when it comes time to write your discussion. And then once you've done that, you will go into the summary. So this should really just adhere to the template of your school. You'll basically recap the major points of the chapter. So kind of going through each of the things that I've mentioned, and really just thinking about what are the big takeaways that someone, that I want someone to take away from my discussion. What were those key findings that I believe are going to have the most implications for practice in this field or with this population? Those things should be highlighted here. But that is the end of my presentation. That's the end of our slides here. Again, we do provide a number of services. So if you are interested or if you feel like you may benefit from assistance, please don't hesitate to reach out. But now I will open it up for questions. So if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat.